Hello, welcome. Is everyone ready to begin? Thank you so very much for coming out. If you were here Thursday, thank you for returning. If this is your first day with us, we hope that you will enjoy this, the fourth installment of the annual Battle of New Orleans Historical Symposium. Yes, we've been doing this for 4 years here at Elaine P. Nunez Community College, mainly because of the work of Dr. Curtis Manning. And we do it here. Yes, a round of applause for Dr. Manning. Thank you very much. And we do it here because we are, first and foremost, Nunez is the only institution for higher education in St. Bernard. And then it's also conveniently located close to the Chalmette battlefield. So it makes sort of a natural extension of reality for us to stage our historical symposium here, and we think this is a fantastic forum because here we're having the open discussion of ideas at a place that is quite comfortable. It's a very nice auditorium, don't you think? Okay, I'm glad you like it. And we're so pleased that you're all here today because we have an outstanding lineup of speakers. Speakers that are going to be addressing topics ranging from Jackson to people who are non-white and their importance in the overall big picture of what happened here 201 years ago. Now, to get the ball rolling this morning, our first speaker is going to be dealing with Andrew Jackson. Maybe you've heard of him. Turns out he was a general that had some influence on what happened here. But Jackson's importance goes beyond just political leadership. It goes to military leadership. And the Jacksonian military experience places its hand on the Battle of New Orleans in a way that's really quite important, quite impressive, and it reveals him to be something of not just a tactical genius, but also someone who could exhibit cultural intelligence as well. We don't normally think of Andrew Jackson in that way, do we? But you're about to hear a lecture where that is certainly a topic that is pressed upon. Donald Keith Midkiff first came to the New Orleans area in 1975. He is a member of this symposium's advisory board, and he is also an author. In 2011, he published the book, New Orleans Besieged, and he's now going to talk to you about that Jacksonian military experience. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Keith Midkiff.
Thanks for that great intro. I hope I can live up to it. The Jacksonian military experience at New Orleans, it sounds like a little obscure topic, but I hope that you'll understand it as being a lot more general and a lot less battle. I wanted to thank everybody for coming out. I'm sure that you're here mostly for the Rocky and Carlos spaghetti and meatballs. So if you came here expecting another talk focused solely on the January 8th engagement, or that I would begin with Jackson riding into New Orleans on December 1st, 1814, you will be a little disappointed. I see the Jacksonian military experience as starting much earlier, and I wanted to say that the Jacksonian military experience at New Orleans was as complex as the man and as varied as the people of New Orleans. The purpose of this talk is to highlight Jackson as a military leader and show how he differed or was similar to other men of his time. The Jacksonian experience, in my opinion, began in the bitterly cold winter of 1813. Tennessee gave an enthusiastic response to Governor Claiborne's call for volunteers to help defend New Orleans from imminent invasion. Jackson gathered over 2,000 militia and cavalry at Nashville and brought them to the Mississippi territorial capital of Washington, some 6 miles east of Natchez. Eager to fight, Jackson had written a letter to the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, prior to leaving Nashville. In that letter, Jackson boasted that he and his Tennesseans were free of any constitutional constraints that kept the regular army from taking Mobile, Pensacola, and St. Augustine. This action, Jackson believed, would deprive the British of using these Spanish ports as a base for operations during any invasion of the United States from the south. Major General James Wilkinson, commander of the 7th Military District, headquartered in New Orleans, ordered Jackson to remain encamped at Washington until further orders. After weeks of waiting, Jackson received a letter from Secretary Armstrong disbanding Jackson's army and refusing to pay the volunteers or provide supplies or transport for the return to Tennessee. Angered at the limited imagination of the federal government and too proud to admit defeat, Jackson led his army of Tennessee volunteers back home in March 1813. Meanwhile, General Jackson received orders from the secretary directing him to take Mobile at once. This required Wilkinson to remove the veteran 3rd Infantry Regiment from New Orleans, leaving only the nascent 44th Infantry Regiment behind. Jackson learned a lesson Napoleon Bonaparte might well have given him. A thing must be done before the announcement of your plans. This was Jackson's first military experience with New Orleans and the politics of war. Major General James Wilkinson was the darling of the federal military establishment in the national capital. It was rumored that he had been a confidant of Aaron Burr before exposed in the conspiracy. The Jeffersonian Republicans ignored his having sworn an oath of allegiance to the King of Spain to cement Kentucky's exclusive trade deal with New Orleans. In spite of his constant need of money, everyone from the president on down trusted the man. Everyone except Andrew Jackson, I might add, whose personal dealings with Wilkinson during the Burr conspiracy had tainted Jackson's reputation while leaving Wilkinson unblemished. Wilkinson didn't take Mobile so much as relieve the Spanish garrison there of their responsibility. He thanked them for their service and provided a ship to carry the garrison to Pensacola. Not a shot was fired. This delighted the War Department as it kept a volatile situation with Spain from exploding into a war where America fired the first shot. Proud of Wilkinson's accomplishment at Mobile, Secretary Armstrong transferred Wilkinson to the Canadian front, where it was hoped that his innovative style would invigorate the stalled campaign up there. Wilkinson failed to live up to expectations. He led an abortive attack against Montreal while consuming a heady mixture of laudanum and alcohol. He was twice attacked by smaller Canadian units before he reached his objective. Wilkinson was so inept, or so intoxicated, that he lost both engagements and barely escaped with his army across the St. Lawrence River and safety in New York. Wilkinson was relieved of command, and he would later return to Mobile, the site of his former glory. General Thomas Flournoy, head of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, replaced Wilkinson as commander of the 7th Military District at Mobile. He saw the regular Army's role on the Gulf Coast as defensive. After all, he now had to defend both Mobile and New Orleans. When the Creek Civil War boiled over into conflict with the United States after the Fort Mims massacre, Flournoy took a backseat to the Mississippi militia led by General Fernando Claiborne, Governor C.C. Claiborne's brother. He saw any movement of the regular army into Creek territory as counter to the necessity of providing a coastal defense against either British or Spanish attack. When his refusal to act directly against the Creeks angered the War Department, Secretary Armstrong reassigned the 3rd Infantry Regiment to the 6th Military District under Major General Thomas Pinckney. A humiliated Flournoy left Mobile for New Orleans, taking with him the logistical support he could still have provided Mississippi and Tennessee militias fighting the Creeks. Flournoy would devote the remainder of his tenure as head of the 7th Military District, badgering Governor Claiborne to raise militia capable of defending the state, even while he encouraged enlistment in the 44th Infantry. He also took to writing letters to the War Department about the lack of loyalty and patriotism in the local Creole population. Flournoy's opinion matched that of Governor Claiborne, and so this belief was passed on to Andrew Jackson when he took over as commander of the 7th Military District. The well, as they say, had been poisoned. Jackson had the same dilemma that had faced Flournoy, but he had a different temperament. He was aggressive, where Flournoy had been passive. Flournoy, a Georgia lawyer before being called up, felt constrained and defensive in his actions. Jackson had already announced that he wasn't as respectful of international boundaries. So, taking offense as the best defense, Jackson attacked Pensacola. Britain's occupation of Pensacola was the perfect cover for his former ambition to deprive the British of a forward base of operations. For Jackson, success at Pensacola meant that only one port on the Gulf Coast remained that would welcome and provide material support to a British invasion force: New Orleans. Sending the 7th Infantry and the 2 companies of the 44th Infantry that had fought with him at Pensacola on ahead, Jackson wrapped up his plans to neutralize New Orleans and return to Mobile. That he didn't expect to be away for long is evident by his decision to place General Wilkinson back in charge of Mobile before he left. The return of the 44th Infantry and its augmentation by the 7th in November 1814 had made the people of New Orleans feel that the federal government was finally going to defend them in the event of an invasion that everyone knew was coming. Claiborne, after all, had been using this as a stick to encourage enlistment in the militia for the last 2 years. The only ones listening to their governor, it seemed, were the new American settlers up in Baton Rouge and northern Louisiana. Wilkinson's capture of Mobile had not fired the imagination or patriotism of New Orleanians, as did Jackson's attack on Pensacola and his defeat of the British there. Now, finally, the great man himself was riding down the Esplanade to Fort St. Charles. He was given a hero's welcome. Jackson had his choice of where to set up his military headquarters while in New Orleans. If logistics were concerned, then he could have continued to stay in the barracks inside Fort St. Charles. He didn't. If working with the governor and legislature and city council had been important, he could have stayed in the luxurious Castellon House, or Tremolet's Hotel, as it was called at the time. The Castellon House had been built by the Baroness Montalba's twice widowed mother before accompanying her daughter to France after Michaela's wedding. It had thick brick walls, a spacious courtyard, and its own dungeon next to the laundry room. Gotta love the Creoles. But as tempting as that might have been, Jackson didn't stay there either. Jackson settled on a small townhouse on the busiest commercial street in New Orleans, Royal. It was not an accident that the location of his headquarters was 1 block away from the post office, half a block away from 2 banks on Conti, and directly across the street from another. Jackson wanted to keep an eye on all that money. And as is often the case in New Orleans, the location came with a little lagniappe. At the far end of the block, across Royal Street on St. Louis, was the pharmacy of Antoine Péchot. And behind Jackson, at the corner of Charters and St. Louis, was Maspero's Exchange Coffee House. Jackson placed himself in the middle of the financial district and as close as possible to the best source of information about how the people of New Orleans really felt. It was only now that Jackson began to learn that some in New Orleans were not in favor of a British occupation. He also learned that many of the city's male residents were trained soldiers, and that while their national loyalty might be questionable, they were a potential asset or an existential threat. As a militia officer, he knew how hard it was to recruit when the regular army offered so many financial inducements. So at the governor's request, Jackson ended any further enlistment in the 44th Infantry. This immediately swelled the ranks of the New Orleans Battalion of Volunteers. Jackson was impressed with the quality of the troops in both the 44th and the New Orleans Battalion, as they would, in turn, become loyal supporters of his actions throughout the remainder of his time in the city. The 2nd Louisiana was a different matter altogether. It had more of a laissez-faire approach to soldiering. Commanded by Colonel Dennis de la Ronde, they appear not to have worked very hard to prepare their defenses. They failed in their task to block the mouth of Bayou Bienvenue to keep the British from using it as a beachhead for their invasion force. In fact, one British account says that it was a fire used to warm a detachment placed at the mouth of the bayou that led them, like a beacon, to the bayou in the pre-dawn hours of December 23, 1814. Now, why was that bayou left open? Why did they light a fire that helped guide the British boats ashore? We may never know for certain. Jackson never pressed the issue. Despite this little oversight, Jackson would continue to depend on Colonel Dennis de la Ronde throughout the New Orleans campaign. Jackson did get some revenge after the battle, however. He assigned the 2nd Louisiana guard duty inside the wet, cold swamp behind the Villeray plantation, where the British still maintained a couple of redoubts holding open Bayou Bienvenue for a returned engagement on the plains of Chalmette. Having failed to keep the British out of Louisiana and failed to dislodge them from their foothold on the Mississippi, Jackson turned to defense. This was a different strategy than building supply force along the Coosa River to fight the Creeks. This required more, and luckily for Jackson, more was at hand. One of Jackson's lucky finds was Arsène Latour, one of the city's leading architects. Latour was a trained military engineer, and Jackson had him strengthen Fort St. Philip and design redoubts below the city at Terre-Boeuf and English Turn. It was Latour's simple design and placement of gun batteries that made the Rodriguez Canal a respectable defensive position that only got stronger with time. The exposed battery number 1 was not part of Latour's original design. Another lucky find was General Jean-Marie Humble Humbert. Humbert was a self-made general, much like Jackson, a man who rose quickly through the ranks to command an army in the field and led the last successful invasion of the British Isles when he landed in Ireland in support of the 1798 rebellion. So Humbert well knew the risks faced by the people of New Orleans should they fail to keep the British out of the city. Jackson would turn over 2/3 of the line to Humbert. Since Humbert was not part of the regular army, Jackson placed him under the nominal command of Colonel Ross of the 44th Infantry. It's interesting to note that while the American right, defended by French Louisianans, was the shortest route to New Orleans, the British only threw Major René's diversionary attack against it. The main British attack will fall on what they saw as the weakest, least capable part of the line, the dirty shirts of Tennessee and Kentucky. It took a week after the British defeat on January 8th before they withdrew from their camp on the Mississippi. They had used the time to build a road through the swamp back to their original beachhead at the mouth of Bayou Bienvenue, a bayou that the British called by its Spanish name, Bayou Cantalan. Jackson had Commodore Patterson move a battery of cannons up on the west bank directly across from the British camp to harass the British night and day. Jackson had made plans for a two-pronged attack on the British camp by having a force cross the Mississippi from the west bank to attack the rear, while Jackson led a frontal assault from Line Jackson. This counterattack never occurred. Just as preparations were finalized, the British Navy began a bombardment of Fort St. Philip at Plaquemines Bend. The bombardment was heavy enough to succeed, but the improvements wrought by Latour and the fort's swampy ground combined to frustrate the British gunners. While this may have always been intended as a diversion, and with at least a third of their army still at Chalmette, a breakthrough by the British Navy, even at this late stage, could well have rewritten history. Any thought Jackson had of a counterattack now went up in black smoke. The British continued their bombardment of Fort St. Philip until the last Army unit had boarded their barges and returned to their transports. End of the story, right? No, not yet. Jackson still had another military experience to endure, the Battle of the Peace. During the height of the battle, Jackson heard a rumor that the state legislature was going to surrender rather than have the city destroyed in combat. Jackson reportedly promised the legislature a hot time if they took such action. Then, to be safe, he had the doors of the State House locked to prevent the legislature from voting for surrender. On February 21st, 1815, the Louisiana Gazette wrote that the British had requested a ceasefire. Jackson demanded a retraction and ordered that no paper in the city was to carry any story on the state of the war that hadn't come from his office. On February 23rd, the Gazette wrote, "As we have been officially informed that the city of New Orleans is a camp, our readers must not expect us to take the liberty of expressing our opinions as we might in a free city." Jackson also turned his attention on the French consul in New Orleans, a man who was himself an American war hero and the founder of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Consul Toussard had been proud of his countrymen, both French and American, when they enlisted, but as the days turned to weeks since the British withdrawal from Chalmette and the Tennessee and Kentucky having been removed some 10 miles from the front, he started writing discharge certificates for anyone claiming a French national identity. Jackson ordered that any newly certified French citizens to remove themselves no less than 100 miles of New Orleans. He also gave Consul Toussard the same banishment and ordered him to leave town no later than 4 o'clock that very afternoon. Jackson's actions against the French and his affront to Colonel Toussard, a representative of France, prompted a state senator, Louis Laloyer, to write an editorial in French in the local newspaper against Jackson's dictatorial actions. Jackson found out who had protested and ordered Laloyer's arrest, which happened as the senator was leaving Maspero's exchange. This led to a series of legal actions that caused Jackson to add U.S. District Judge Dominic Hall and U.S. District Attorney Dick to the same jail cell as Laloyer. Jackson exiled Hall and Dick, but Laloyer was ordered to stand trial for espionage. Laloyer was found not guilty of espionage on a technicality, as he hadn't been found lurking in a military camp, but in a saloon. Can't write this stuff. So the charge of espionage was refused by the court. Now remember, this is a hand-picked military court, and they refused to follow Jackson's lead. Jackson was not amused and had the senator returned to his jail cell. Jackson finally relented and lifted martial law in March 1815. Judge Hall immediately returned and ordered Jackson to stand trial for obstructing the duties of the court. Jackson's trial had a foregone conclusion. Hall found Jackson guilty and fined him $1,000. Jackson wrote a check payable to the court and refused any help from his supporters to pay the fine for him. The city was relieved when Jackson left the city for Tennessee in April 1815. He left with one more experience, or perhaps a lack of one would be more correct. Jackson was the only senior officer to have fought at the Battle of New Orleans that wasn't recognized by name and thanked by the Louisiana legislature for his service to the state. It made quite an outrage across the country, by the way. So George S. Patton has a famous quote from the Calvary Journal of 1933 that supports the idea of the indispensable man. Wars may be fought with weapons, Patton said, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads them that gains the victory. Thank you. Any questions or anything from?
Where's Jackson's headquarters? Is that where the Louisiana Supreme Court building is?
Yes, roughly, it was directly across from the Louisiana State Bank, the pink building that's now a restaurant, and was the home for Paul Morphy, the chess champion. Morphy, by the way, his father had been the Spanish consul and also allowed Spanish subjects or citizens to serve with Jackson, and then also wrote excuses to get him out of service. But there was fewer Spanish serving, and it didn't bother Jackson nearly as much. It may have also been that Morphy was an Irishman, as Jackson was also Irish. Yes?
Is it true that Jackson was ill during this time?
Yes. That's why the lagniappe of having a private chemist pharmacy down the street from him was very, very tempting, and I think played a role. Not only was it so he could watch the banks, but also he could get medicine on the QT from Paschal, who was also a Mason. And one thing with Masons is they don't do each other harm, even if Paschal was French and Jackson wasn't. The question wasn't Jackson ill at the time? And he was ill. He hadn't been himself since he led his troops down to Natchez in 1813. Any other questions? We're out of time, almost out of time. Yes. He did cross the lake at Madisonville, yes. It took him 12 hours to go from Madisonville to the bridge across Bayou St. John. He came up Bayou at night and stopped at what was called the Spanish House, which would have been at the bridge, and my best guess is that that's actually the Pito House. That would have been the Spanish House. It would have been a nice place. Jackson came with just his headquarters unit, so it was only 5 or 6 men that were with him, and they came on horseback. Actually, it's not defined, but because Jackson declared the city of New Orleans and its environs as a military camp, and he was the military commander that placed the whole city under martial law, he basically had the governor and the legislature and the city council and the mayor and the courts, all of them were now dependent on him. They could just fold shop and let Jackson. Jackson said he was the only man qualified to administer the law in New Orleans. Oh yeah, and that's what led to Laloyer's arrest, and then his being skulking around in military camp. Jackson used an old 1798 law that said any foreigner found skulking around a military camp was automatically assumed to be a spy and could be shot. Yes. That was during the mutinies there and during the Creek War. I don't think it occurred right at Mobile. I could be wrong, but it became a big political thing after the war because Jackson wanted to become president. But he only had one soldier shot, and that was an 18-year-old who decided that he wanted to go home to Tennessee. But Jackson had to make a definitive statement, and he had that one young man executed by firing squad. Everybody else he either let go or bullied into staying by aiming guns and cannons at them. Jackson learned from the mutinies there from the Tennessee troops that he couldn't back down. Once he made a statement, he couldn't back down. I think that pretty much ends my time here. Yes, one more. Well, General Carroll was one of the Tennessee, William Carroll was a close friend of Andrew Jackson, and actually Jackson's assisting Carroll at a duel led to Jackson getting his first bullet wound. The guy that Carroll defeated in the duel, his family came after Jackson. They didn't go after Carroll. So Carroll was definitely politically connected to Jackson. Thank y'all.